In this lecture, I'm going to be looking at Marxism and Neo-Marxism in terms of their key principles related to society and the way society is structured, rather than any specific beliefs of Marxism in terms of like education, family, or anything like that. We'll actually look at that as part of those topics. But I've combined Marxism and Neo-Marxism within this lecture because Neo-Marxism is building on Marxism. Neo meaning new, so it's taking the criticisms of Marxism and trying to improve on them in its theory. So we'll start off with the traditional Marxism and then see how that thought about society, we'll evaluate it, and then look at the developments of neo-Marxism. So if we get a little bit of background on Marxism, it is the work of Karl Marx, who was a lawyer, a philosopher, an economist, a sociologist, a political speaker. He was a bit of a polymath. And he was born in Germany, but moved around quite a bit. He moved to Paris in 1843 and then into London in 1849. And he spent a majority of his life in poverty. Frederick Engels, on the other hand, was born in Prussia, which is modern-day Belgium, France area. He met Marx in Paris in 1844, but he spent most of his life moving around Europe, mostly due to his atheist religious beliefs, which in a very religious Europe at the time were not particularly welcome. But once he met up with Marx in Paris, he began to support Marx financially and intellectually and collaborated with him on a number of projects, including the famous book Das Kapital. But Marxism is similar in a way to what we've already covered in functionalism, in the sense that it is a structural theory, meaning that it is looking at society's structures and institutions and how they shape society in the way it functions and the behaviours of the individuals within it. It is also a macro approach, looking at society as a whole rather than the individual's meanings and individuals' reactions and experiences of the society. And just like functionalism, it does use the scientific method and takes a positivist approach to research, following the guidelines and the paradigms of the natural sciences. But unlike functionalism, Marxism sees society as being in conflict rather than consensus. In particular, they see conflict between the classes. So there is a constant battle, if you like, between the classes within society rather than this happy, clappy, joyful society that the functionalists put forward. And also they believe that social change is not smooth or gradual. It is quick, it is violent, it is rapid, and it is shocking. So they believe in order for social change to happen, there has to be this revolution. Now that revolution doesn't necessarily have to be a violent overthrowing of whatever, but it is rapid. And it is a sudden change rather than one that is slow and gradual that the functionalists make it out to be. Now, the Marxists have some key concepts that help to explain why society is the way that it is, or to explain what society is like. Now, the thing to remember is when we're talking about modern society, and the Marxist view of modern society is that the Marxists don't like the way that the modern society is. They explain it and say, well, this is what modern society is like. We just don't like it. Okay, so they are critical of modern society. But let's look at what the key foundation, the key concepts and the foundations of Marxism are. So the first key idea of Marxism is historical materialism. Now, what Marx means by that, when he's talking about materialism, he's talking about material needs: food, shelter, clothing. The things that we require to survive, that we have to create. So we're not talking about things like breathing, like oxygen, but the things that we actually have to create in order to survive. And when he's talking about historical, he's talking about the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. So this class-based society, or this class-based struggle that is quintessential to society. Every society has it at some point. And this historical materialism is also economically determined. So they use the term economic determinism, and so therefore the economy is the driving force in society and is linked to social change inextricably. So what Marx is saying is the social change is linked to the material needs that that society needs, how they're created and how they're distributed. And that creation and distribution is what causes the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. So this historical materialism that Marx is talking about is saying that society is in a constant battle, if you like, battle being quite a harsh term, but appropriate, I think, created by economic means between what we create and how that creation is distributed between the people within that society. So, and this historical materialism is apparent in all societies because of the structure of society, which brings us on to our second key concept, which is this economic base and superstructure design of society. And every society has these two elements. However, there is differences in how they are in the relationship between the two. So when talking about the superstructure, Marx is talking about the ideological, cultural and political institutions and practices that come from the economic base. So there's kind of a circular element to this. And the superstructure is the norms and values, the ideologies, the intangible elements, if you like, of society and the processes by which those are transferred from social institutions to the individuals. Remember, Marxism is a top-down approach, meaning that it's the social institutions that tell people what their norms and values are. And according to Marx, a superstructure exists to maintain and legitimize the interests of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and to ensure their economic dominance. And it is inextricably linked to the economic base. Now, the economic base is the material or economic infrastructure and the foundation to society. It's broken down into two parts, the first being the mode of production, which includes, or the means of production, which includes tools, machinery, technology, land, and the relations of production, which is the relationship between the workers and the owners. Now, Marx identified several distinct modes of production that existed through history, and we'll come on to those in a second. But within each of these modes of production, there is a specific economic relationship between property ownership, class division, and workers. According to Marx, the economic base is what determines the social and political structure of society. And as we go through these different types of society in a minute, you'll see what I mean here. So for Marx, there is a process to society. It is a timeline, if you like, of different societies that lead from one to the next. So the first stage of society, the first sort of society that we had, he referred to as primitive communism. And this is the earliest stages of human society, hunter-gatherer communities. So we're talking prehistory, cavemen, Neanderthals, whatever language you want to use. In this stage, people lived in communal groups and they shared resources and labour collectively because it was necessary for survival. There was no private property, there was no class distinctions. Everybody supported and helped everybody else. And this was necessary for survival. Everyone had to go out hunting, everyone had to go out gathering, everyone had to help with security, because there were bigger, better predators out there that could eat you, literally. And so the production methodologies, the production forces were limited. It was a very egalitarian society. But this led into what Marx referred to as slavery, or the slave society. And this developed with agriculture and settled communities. Whereas primitive communism, the tribes, the communities would be transient. They would move around depending on where the hunting fields were and migration patterns and things like that. Slave society developed once people started to settle down and create permanent homesteads and permanent communities. And with this became the ability to have surplus production. So what this means is that it allowed for people to create more than they needed. This surplus allowed for the emergence of social classes, and slavery became a prominent feature. Slave societies were characterized by ownership of land and slaves by the ruling class, the slave owners, who exploited the labor of the slave class. We're talking here ancient civilizations like Greece and Rome, where they had examples of slave societies. So we're not talking about the slave trade of the 1800s here, we're still in ancient society. But you had very clear distinctions between citizens and slaves. Now, for example, in ancient Roman society, when the Romans went out and conquered pretty much the entire world, they would give the conquered societies a choice. They could join the Roman Empire and become citizens, or they would be taken as slaves. So this slave culture, where the slaves were captured, yes, they were sold between the ruling class, but rather than it being a ruling class like we would imagine today, it was more citizen versus slave. Citizens had rights, citizens had property, they were allowed ownership, slaves were not. As society has then progressed, slave societies moved into feudalism. So we're now kind of Middle Ages era, and feudal societies were characterized by a hierarchical structure where you had landowning nobles who controlled the land, peasants who worked the land for production, and feudal lords held all the economic and political power. The difference here between the slave society and feudal society is the serfs, or the peasantry, still had some rights, and they weren't owned by the landowners, but the land in which they worked was owned by the landowners. So the peasants and the serfs were bound to the land rather than bound to the landowner, if that makes sense. So whereas in slavery, the slave would be owned by the ruling class, the slave owners, in feudalism, the peasantry were bound to the land, which was then owned by a landowner, but rather than owned by the landowner, if that makes sense. And those who were bound, the serfs who were bound to the land, they could not leave or change their social position without the support or the agreement of that landowner. Okay, So this kind of is the Middle Ages, and we see the nobilities and things like that. A good example of this kind of landowner relationship would be after William the Conqueror conquered England. He gave land to his supporters, taking land away from his enemies, obviously, many of whom he killed. But the peasantry who worked that land stayed with the land. And if the landowner changed, if they were given promotion or they were moved to somewhere, given another area by the monarchy, the peasantry would stay with the land. Whereas under slavery, they would move with their landowner. Okay. The next level is where we're sitting today. And this kind of came around through the Industrial Revolution, 1700s, 1800s kind of era, and that is capitalism. And capitalism came with the rise of industrialization, the expansion of trade, and the beginnings of globalization, if you like. Capitalism is characterized by private ownership of the means of production. So the factories, the machinery, the raw materials of the creation. And this led to the emergence of the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, and the proletariat, the working class. The bourgeoisie owned the means of production and, according to Marx, exploited the labor of the proletariat, who would create everything by means of and allowing for the generation of profits. And capitalism is marked by the pursuit of profit and accumulation of capital and wealth. And Marx points out here, this is where we start to see the alienation of the proletariat. And what he meant by this is the separation of the worker from the thing that they are creating. So under feudalism, under slavery, under primitive communism, the worker would create what they needed and then sell off the surplus or share out the surplus. Under capitalism, the worker is creating the product or the product for the owner. If the worker wants that product, they have to buy it. And they buy it at a marked up profit price. Now, they may get a discount because they work for that particular company, but they're still paying a markup price. And that profit doesn't go back to the worker, it goes to the owner. So in a factory scenario, it doesn't matter how many of the product the worker makes on their factory line, they are only going to get paid a certain amount. And if they want to purchase or if they want to have the thing that they are making, then they have to buy it. Okay, so we've got a very clear class-based system with the haves, the bourgeoisie, and the have-nots, the proletariat. Now, Marx said eventually the proletariat would wake up to this exploitation, and this would lead to a revolution, which would overthrow capitalism and lead into the next stage of society, which is socialism. And here, the means of production is owned by government. Okay, still not owned by the people, is owned by government. So everything is nationalized. Everyone, you still have a monetary system, you still go to work and you still create the product and then you have to buy it back, but there is very little private ownership. It is owned all by government. And this is what we've seen in the USSR, in Cuba, in China. It's not pure communism, it is socialism, because it is ownership by government. Okay, and eventually this will develop further to communism. Pure communist utopia, as Marx referred to, is ownership by all. And this would be a classless society. It'd be a moneyless society because everyone would get what they needed. And the nature of this society is where you would put the needs of your community above your own personal needs. It is a selfless society, and everyone would get what they needed. There would be no need for private ownership. Everyone would be doing what was necessary to maintain the society, similar to the primitive communism, but this time not because it was necessary for survival, because you've got bigger, badder predators that are out to eat you, but because everyone is thinking of the whole rather than the individual. Now, Marx did say that he felt that pure communism would be very difficult to come by due to the human nature and the effects of communism, which has made society quite selfish. There have been examples of communist communes, of small communities, the kibbutzes in Israel, communes where you have a few hundred people living for the collective, but in general, on a large worldwide scale, Marx was unsure that this would ever fully materialize. Now, the next key idea of Marxism is looking more at capitalism and this idea of exploitation. So Marx said that the current societal system we live in is a capitalist society, and that is characterized by the division between the class of owners, the bourgeoisie, and the class of laborers, the proletariat. So in Marx's idea, we have a two-class system, those who have and those who have not. And he said that capitalism has three distinct features. Alienation of the workers from their products, which we've already talked about. So the concentration of the means of production. So this is where the bourgeoisie really kind of are selfish about those means of production, about their factories, about their access to raw materials, to access to technology and things like that. They don't share willingly. There's very little, if you think of in terms of open access to the means of production, and low wages but high profits. So what Marx is saying here is that the proletariat are paid the least that the owners can get away with in order to maximize the profits that they get, therefore solidifying their wealth, and with their wealth comes power. So as charitable and as altruistic as company owners might want to appear, the bottom line is, in a capitalist society, there is exploitation. The goal is profits over people. Now, you may argue then, if we know that this is happening, if we know that this is a society in which we live, why is it that we don't do anything about it? Which leads us on to our next idea, which is false class consciousness and revolution. Now, what Marx argued was the reason why we are stuck in this capitalist society is because the proletariat live in a state of false class consciousness. What this means is that we are not that we're unaware of our oppression, but the oppression that we experience is so normal and so part of our day-to-day existence that we just don't see is there anything wrong with it. We're not talking extreme oppression here or extreme exploitation here, such as sweatshops and things like that. We do those we fight against, but the day-to-day oppression of going to work, getting paid as little as the company can get away with, and then going out and having to buy the products from in terms of that alienation. We just see that as normal way of life. And there is the bourgeoisie through the superstructure send out this message of, if you work hard, you can become the ruling class, you can become the bourgeoisie. And the proletariat have taken that belief and internalized it to the extent that they're kind of like, yeah, that's right, if I want to be the bourgeoisie, I just need to work hard enough, I just need to be better, without recognizing the structural barriers that are in the way of them actually doing that. But then we also have what Marx refers to as repressive state apparatus, which are people like the military, the police, the criminal justice system, who are out to protect the power of the ruling class. Now, these repressive state apparatus may on the surface look as though they are protecting everybody, but the reality is that their main goal is to protect the power and the wealth of the ruling class and prevent the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, from having the revolution that's going to overthrow the capitalist system. Now, this might all seem like, okay, this kind of makes sense, but if we know all this, why aren't we doing anything about it? The problem with one of the key problems with Marxism is it's an oversimplification. In one sense, the class system itself, he's talking about a two-class system of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Life is a lot more complicated than that. Society is a lot more complicated than that. The current British Social Attitude Survey identifies 7 different classes within society. And even that determination of what we mean by class is really difficult to determine. Are we talking about pure wealth? Are we talking about assets? Are we talking about education? Are we talking about power and status? Are we talking about culture? So it's very difficult to determine social mobility when you can't determine your starting point. Secondly is the economic determinism. Everything is determined by economics, by the capitalist system, according to Marx. And that, according to some, is not the way, that's not necessarily the only thing that is determining the way that society is. It's not just about our economic system. It's not just about the means of production, the modes of production. Society is more complex than that. It's also argued that Marxism is out of date. It is a structural approach. It is a meta-narrative that the postmodernists would argue no longer applies to modern society. We now have more choice. We can choose our path in life, and the class system is outdated. It's too simplified, it's too structured to take into account the diversity that is experienced within modern society. And the biggest criticism of Marxism is the fact that there's still not been a revolution. We are over 150 years, nearly 200 years since Marx was writing, and the revolution still hasn't come. And if we're aware of this oppression, if we're aware of our exploitation, surely by now we would have risen up and overthrown this capitalist system. But we haven't. So maybe Marxism isn't quite right. And that brings us into Neo-Marxism. And there are 2 types of Neo-Marxism that we're going to discuss. There are a load more, but we only need to discuss these 2 really. The first is structural Neo-Marxism, which comes from the work of Althusser. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he was trying to overcome the criticism that the Marxist superstructure economic base system was too simplified, that it was breaking down the societal systems too much. And it suggests that society is far more complicated than Marx suggested, which we can agree on. So he said that society isn't just two levels, it's three. You've got the economic level, which is about the producing of goods, satisfying needs, the means of production. You've then got the political level, which is all forms of organisation within a society, hierarchies, political systems, social systems, and includes the repressive state apparatus, which are the means by which these structures are protected and maintained. Finally, he talks about the ideological level, and this is the norms and values, the ideological state apparatus, the means of socializing these people within society, and talks about the ways people see themselves in their world in order to make sense of it. So he took something that was overly simplified and complicated it. This was added to by Crabbe, something like that, who used what he called the three-story building analogy. So he's taken Althusser's ideas and tried to make it understandable. So he said at the bottom of the building, you've got the economic level. This is your shop. This is where you make things and you sell things. This is where your money comes from. This is your business. He then said the next level is your offices. So this is the political level. This is where you do your contracts, where you do your timesheets, where you work out your shift patterns, you do your ordering and your advertising and things like that. And then the top floor is your living quarters. This is your ideological level. And this is where you live your life, if you like. This is where you live your ideals, your norms and your values come into play. So this was aiming to build a slightly more understandable version of society. And in one regard it did that. However, you could argue that this idea over complicates things. So yes, it is expanding on what Marx was saying, but it also overcomplicates it. This system also discourages political activism by suggesting that individuals can do little to change society, that this structure is set and there's not a lot we can do about it. We just have to accept it. Which therefore ignores examples of working class struggles that have actually changed society. And Althusser himself has been criticized as being an elitist who suggests that we should just follow along blindly. We don't need to kind of question anything. We should just get on with it. The other type of neo-Marxism is humanistic neo-Marxism, and this is the work of Gramsci. And Gramsci uses the concept of hegemony, which means the dominance in society of particular ideology, in this case ruling class ideology, and the acceptance of and consent by the rest of society to buy into this hegemony. So he was trying to deal with the criticism that Marxism suggests that we are passive puppets, that there is determinism, and trying to show that there is an element of voluntarism to the current system. And he suggested that there are three ways that we have this voluntarism. So the first, he talked about coercion and consent. So he's talking about how the ruling class maintain their power. He says that the ruling class are a minority. So there has to be a means by which this minority of people are able to maintain their power and their control over the majority. And the way they do this is through coercion and consent. Now, the coercion is the use of the repressive state apparatus, such as army, police, and other government agencies, to basically force people to accept ruling class ideology. It's our way, or you're going to get punished. Prison, disappearances, that sort of thing. The other way is through consent, which leads into this idea of dual consciousness. So the suggestion is that the ruling class persuade the working class that the ideas and values are legitimate, that the ruling class ideology is legitimate. And by accepting that, we get dual consciousness, where the working class can see that they are being exploited and they are being oppressed, but because of the acceptance that the ruling class ideology is legitimate, they accept their oppression. So although they can see through it to a certain extent, they are still accepting that this is the natural way forward. This is natural society. And then what Gramsci says is that we need to get an organic intellectual who can help people to see through this legitimization of ruling class ideology in order to facilitate revolution. And these organic intellectuals, or what Gramsci refers to as organic intellectuals, these are not people who are necessarily people who are academic or geniuses in any way. An organic intellectual is a special individual who gives voice to those that need it or inspire social class into action. And there have been examples of organic intellectuals throughout history. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Emmeline Pankhurst could all be considered organic intellectuals. Greta Thunberg could be considered an organic intellectual. Now, the issue here is that this has not created the proletariat revolution that Marx was talking about, because these organic intellectuals have had specific groups or specific issues that they are dealing with. Emmeline Pankhurst was votes for women. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were the civil rights movement and racial equality. Greta Thunberg has been about environmental issues. There hasn't yet been a class-based organic intellectual to bring together the working class to overthrow the capitalist system. Now, the problem with this humanistic neo-Marxism is its underemphasis on the role of the coercive political and economic forces which are holding back the chance of a counter-hegemonic bloc. So it's workers are unable to form a revolutionary vanguard because of the threat of state violence. These repressive state apparatus are preventing the rise of the class-based organic intellectual who is going to bring about this revolution. So the power is underemphasizing the power of the ruling class to maintain itself and to maintain that social inequality that is preventing revolution from occurring. Okay, so that leads to that's kind of a very brief, if you like, overview of Marx's view of society. And remember, the Marxists don't like where society is. They believe it needs to move forward into socialism and communism. They don't like capitalism. But the idea is that we are in a class-based society which is ruled by those who have wealth and those who have power, in order through the exploitation of those who don't have wealth or power, which keeps us in the society that we're in. But eventually we will have this organic intellectual class-based organic intellectual who will rise up and bring everybody together to overthrow the capitalist system. Perhaps not in our lifetime, but it may happen eventually.